Okay, let's create our directory structure of our to-do list app. The first thing we want to do is we want to create the index.html. So I'm going to say index.html. I'm using VS Code. It's a pretty nice editor. Then the next thing we want to create is style.css. And then of course we want to create script.js. All right, that should be a good start. So index.html is going to hold our markup, style.css is going to hold our CSS, and then the script.js is going to hold our JavaScript. So this is a pretty simple directory structure, but it's going to suffice in our case. Okay, I have added some basic markup to our little form. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an H1, which is, remember, H1s are very important for accessibility because people with screen readers usually browse the website through headings. Now, you can't do that without a screen reader right now unless you use anchored links. So the developer has to add anchored links. But screen readers use headings. Screen reader users use headings a lot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say to-do list. This is the name of my heading. And here we're going to add two attributes. The first thing we're going to add is tab index -1. Now what that's going to do is this is going to make our H1 focusable programmatically with JavaScript. But if users press tab, they're not going to be able to focus the H1. And we want to do that because H1 is not an interactive element by default. So with tab index -1, we're making it a semi-interactive. So it's not interactive off the bat, but it's interactive via JavaScript. And then the next thing we're going to do is add an ID called heading. Okay, we're not going to use the ID for styling, we're just going to use it for our JavaScript. And then we want to create a form. Interesting. I think my Emmet output a bunch of code. We don't want that, we want to write the form. And you might be wondering, Stephanie, why are you adding a form if you're not actually going to submit this? If you're not going to submit the form, since you're only going to use JavaScript. Well, the thing is, since we want to make our to-do list accessible, okay, it makes much more sense to use the form element and to add the label in the input inside the form element, since it makes it more accessible by default. For example, if you have a label and an input here, less screen readers will be able to recognize that the label is connected to the to the input. But if you have this code inside a form, more screen readers will announce it and connect it via a relationship, if that makes sense. So that's why we're using a form. And also in a real life app, you probably need to submit the form anyways, be it via fetch or via PHP. So now that we have our form, what we want to do is we want to have an action. The form is we're just going to prevent submitting it in this point, but what I learned was you need to add text between the action in order to validate as a valid HTML. So I'm just going to write the name of the file, and then we want method post. So we don't want the submitted stuff to be in the URI, and the ID is going to be to do form. Okay, and then so the next thing we want to do is we want to create our input. And the first thing we need, of course, is a label, because whenever users land on the input, we want the screen readers to announce the label text. So what we do then is we have our label, and now we're going to add the label for our input. And to do that, we're going to add the text here, which is add a new task to your list, required. Okay, so required is going to, well, it's going to show to the user that it's required. And since we only have one field in our form, I prefer to spell it out required instead of using the star. Now, if you have multiple required fields in the form, it is better to use the star and then describe it at the beginning of the form that all fields with a star are required. But since we only have one, we don't need a star. Okay, so I'm going to revert back to the required, and the label needs a couple of attributes. So the first thing is for to do, and then the other attribute is an ID of to do form. Okay. Now the IDs are very important because without them we won't be able to connect the JavaScript form. Okay. And after we have this label, what we want to do is add a div, and inside the div we want to add our input. This is where users will enter their task, so this is really, really important. So what we want to say is add a couple of attributes. So I'm going to add a class, and I'm just going to go ahead and add this attribute. They're pretty straightforward. All right, so this is our input field. The next thing we want to add is going to be the submit button. So I'm gonna add it very quick. Okay, I added the submit button, and I gave it the name of add since it's much more useful for the user rather than submit. Okay, it seems like everything is in order here. The next thing we want to do is add an example. So this is going to be kind of tricky, but just bear with me. We want to give a hint to the user as to what kind of input is expected. This is great for accessibility, and it is actually inside, it's an inside recommendation of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So the way to do that is, now a lot of people would just default, this is what I see with a lot of those apps. What they would do is they would add the hint inside the placeholder, and they will say things like feed chicken, and this is going to be the hint. Okay, but the problem is placeholders are not accessible because, first of all, let me actually show you and explain why they're not accessible. This is our app so far with the code we've written, and this is our hint, feed chicken, and this might look really nice, but the problem is when you start typing, the hint disappears, so you have no idea what it was. And another problem is a lot of forms utilize autocomplete, so they have like a lot of inputs, and then when you populate the first input, you're given the option to autocomplete the rest of the inputs, and people usually enable this. And now imagine if all of those hints are just full with text supplied by the autocomplete, then you're never going to see the hint. And then a lot of developers also use the placeholder as a label, which is extremely terrible for accessibility, but that's another lecture. And then, so that's one of the problems. The other problem is the text is light green on a white background. So the contrast is really low, meaning that people who are visually impaired, the elderly population, or if you just have glasses with really, or if you're just not wearing your glasses, it will be difficult for those people to see the hint. And I know what you're thinking. Well, you can change the color of the placeholder via CSS. Yes, you can. But the problem is, if you do that, then the input text is going to look like it's normal text, and then people will click on it and try to delete it, but they couldn't because it's a placeholder text. So, anyways, this is why I don't like placeholders, and you shouldn't use them. So, what we're gonna do is we're going to use a good old-fashioned text, but we want to connect the text to the input field. So the way to do that, first of all, let's remove this terrible placeholder. So this is our input here, right? This is our button, this is our input. The way to do that is, since we're still in the label, okay, so all that is connected to the label. Actually, yeah, this is actually a mistake. That shouldn't be connected to the label. Let me close the label. The label is going to be separate. So we have the label here. Oops. We have the label here, and then we have a div that contains the input and our submit button. Okay, now it makes more sense. So then beneath that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another div like this, and then I'm going to add the text example, feed chicken. Okay, Stephanie learned to spell. Okay. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give it an ID of example, and I'm going to give it a class of example. And then after I have given, now remember this ID is example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside my input, which is this thing right here. And then I'm going to add the attribute called area described by, and I'm going to give it the ID of the text that's going to be described. In this case, it's going to be example over here. So what aria described by is, it provides further information about an element. So the screen reader, when the screen reader lands on our input, it's going to say, add a new list, add a new task to your list required. Then it's going to take a pause and it's going to say, example, feed the chicken. So that pause is going to give the user extra information in case they are wondering what input the input field expects. And the way to do that is by adding aria described by. And the nice thing about aria described by is that the user will still hear the text in the label over here, and then after a pause, it will hear the text over here. And this is the way it's done is you can put it in any element. Now the element must be inside the form element. So it must be a child of the form element, and it cannot be a second label, because if you add more than one label for an input, just all hell breaks loose. I don't recommend it because screen readers don't support it, and just it's bad. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is add our list. So we want to exit the form, and we want to add the list that is going to contain our list items. So we want to give it an ID of list and a class of list. Oops. All right. And so inside here, there are actually no elements, and we're going to keep it that way. So the next thing I want to add is we're going to add the live region. Now what the live region is, it's a markup that you mark saying specifically you are going to be in charge of notifying the screen reader about any change on the page. And the way to do that is you create a div and then you add a row status. Now the row can either be alert or status. I think there are a couple more rows as well. We're going to add status because you use alert when you want to alert the user. But since we only want this live region to say task added and task removed, this is not actually an alert, but it's rather a status of our application. And then we want to put aria live and we want to set it to polite. Now what aria live is, it's going to say to the screen readers, hey, it's going to say that to the screen readers behind the scene, hey, I don't have any text right now, but I'm going to have text later on after user interaction. And when I have text later on, I want you to announce the text to the screen right away. Okay, this is what aria live is. And there are two values to this attribute. It's polite or assertive. What polite is, polite will wait for the screen reader to finish announcing what it's currently announcing before it says it. And assertive is going to, I always misspell this. Assertive is going to interrupt the screen reader and it's going to say it. But it's much better to use polite whenever possible, because it's much better user experience, because you don't want to interrupt the current user. It's okay to interrupt them if there's like an alert or if something requires their immediate attention, but that's not the case with this program here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some IDs and classes. Okay, awesome. And then I'm going to add a comment here, just so the next developer after me doesn't delete this div. And you might be thinking, Stephanie, why are you not hiding the div? Why are you not hiding the live region? Well, because screen readers have various support of aria live. So aria live is really, really confusing for screen readers. And some of them support it to hide it at first and then show it only when there's text. But most screen readers support aria only if it's shown. Because like I said earlier, when the screen reader loads the page, the aria live, this region over here, communicates to the screen reader, be like, hey, I'm going to be with text very soon. But if it's hidden, some screen readers are not going to get the message. Okay. So the last thing we want to do is just connect our script. Okay. Okay, the markup is finished and this looks pretty good. Now, what we're going to do is in the next lecture, we're going to add the styles and make this a little bit nicer.